Revenue regulations in Philippine taxation. In the Philippines, revenue regulations are a type of administrative issuance that serve as legislative rules issued by the Secretary of Finance upon the recommendation of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue to implement and enforce the provisions of the National Internal Revenue Code and related tax laws. Legal basis is Section 244 of the NIRC, which states that the Secretary of Finance, upon recommendation of the Commissioner, shall promulgate all needful rules and regulations for the effective enforcement of the provision of this code. Purpose and function: to implement new tax laws or amendments like the Train Law and the Create Act, clarify ambiguous provisions in the tax code, standardize tax procedures and terminology, and provide guidelines for compliance, reporting, and documentation. They also is used now to introduce new systems like the e-invoicing and the VAT threshold. Revenue Memorandum Orders in Philippine Taxation. Revenue Memorandum Orders, on the other hand, are official issuance by the Bureau of Internal Revenue that provides internal directives, instructions, and operational guidelines to ensure consistent implementation of tax laws and policies across all BIR offices. Purpose of RMOs: standardize BIR operations across regional and district offices, ensure uniform application of tax laws and regulations, improve efficiency and transparency in tax administration, and provide procedural guidance for new or amended tax policies. Legal status: RMOs are not laws, but they carry the force of administrative rules within the BIR. They must be consistent with the National Internal Revenue Code and other revenue regulations. While RMOs are primarily for internal use, they also affect taxpayers indirectly by shaping how BIR enforces tax laws. Revenue Memorandum Rulings. In the Philippines, revenue memorandum rulings are official interpretations and opinions issued by the Commissioner of Internal Revenue regarding the application of tax laws to specific factual situations. These rulings help clarify how the provisions of the tax code and other laws should be applied in practice. Key features of RMRs. No? These are issued by the Commissioner of Internal Revenue. Its nature is to interpret, no? Not legislate. Uh, Applies to specific cases but may be used as precedent to guide taxpayers and BIR personnel on how tax laws apply to particular facts. And authority: the BIR rulings must not contradict RMRs, otherwise they are considered null and void ab initio. Cases are used, no, for clarifying tax treatment of complex transactions, determining eligibility for exemptions or incentives, resolving ambiguities in the application of tax laws, and providing guidance on new or evolving tax issuance. Legal weight: while RMRs are not laws, they carry significant weight in administrative proceedings and are often used as reference points in tax audits, assessments, and taxpayers' inquiries. They help ensure uniform interpretation of tax laws across BIR offices. This is the summary of the difference, no, from other issuance. The revenue regulations are issued by the Secretary of Finance. The nature is legislative, while the scope applies to all taxpayers. Revenue Memorandum Order is issued by the BIR Commissioner. The nature is operational and for internal BIR procedures, while Revenue Memorandum Rulings are issued by the Commissioner. This is a interpretative and specific factual cases, while the BIR rulings are issued by the BIR legal divisions, also interpretative and individual taxpayers' queries. Principle of non-retroactivity of rulings in Philippine taxation. In the Philippines, the principle of non-retroactivity of rulings is a well-established doctrine that protects taxpayers from the retroactive application of new or revised interpretations of tax laws and regulations. For the legal basis, the principle is anchored in Section 246 of the National Internal Revenue Code, which states that any revocation, modification, or reversal of any of the rules and regulations promulgated by the Commissioner or any of the rulings or circulars issued by him shall not be given retroactive effect if the revocation, modification, or reversal will be prejudicial to the taxpayers. This means exceptions to non-retroactivity. Retroactive application may be allowed in the following situations: if the taxpayer deliberately misstates or omits material facts, if the facts subsequently gathered are materially different from those on which the ruling was based, and if the taxpayer acted in bad faith. These exceptions are meant to prevent abuse of the system and ensure fairness in enforcement. Implications for taxpayers. Taxpayers can rely on existing BIR rulings when planning transactions. If a ruling is later reversed or modified, the taxpayer is not liable for penalties or additional taxes for actions taken in good faith under the previous interpretation. This principle promotes stability and predictability in the tax system. Nature of internal revenue laws in Philippine taxation. In the Philippines, internal revenue laws are primarily civil in nature, although they may contain penal provisions for violation. Civil nature of internal revenue laws. Internal revenue laws are designed to regulate the collection of taxes and ensure compliance with tax obligations. Their primary purpose is revenue generation, not punishment. As such, tax assessments, penalties, and interest are considered civil liabilities. The Bureau of Internal Revenue may impose surcharges and interest for late or deficient payments, which are civil penalties, and taxpayers may settle liabilities through administrative remedies such as compromise, settlements, or installment payments. This civil character is emphasized in Revenue Regulations number 12-99, which outlines procedures for tax assessments and the imposition of civil penalties and interest. Penal provisions for tax violations. While the laws are civil in nature, they also contain penal provisions for willful violations such as failure to file tax returns, filing false or fraudulent returns, and tax evasion. These acts can lead to criminal prosecution under the National Internal Revenue Code, particularly under Section 255, which penalizes willful failure to file returns or supply correct information. However, the Supreme Court clarified that a final tax assessment is not required before initiating criminal prosecution, but for civil liability, a final assessment by the Commissioner of Internal Revenue is necessary. Dual nature, civil and penal. Thus, internal revenue laws in the Philippines have a dual nature: civil for collection, assessment, and administrative enforcement; penal for prosecuting deliberate violation of tax laws. This duality ensures both compliance and accountability, while protecting taxpayers' rights through due process. Interpretation of tax laws in the Philippines. In the Philippines, the interpretation of tax laws is guided by statutory provisions, administrative issuance, and judicial decisions. Statutory interpretation. Tax laws are primarily interpreted based on the National Internal Revenue Code. The general rule is strict interpretation against the government in cases of tax imposition, liberal interpretation in favor of the taxpayer when it comes to exceptions or deductions, unless clearly stated otherwise. These principles ensure that taxes are not imposed unless clearly authorized by law. Role of the Bureau of Internal Revenue. The BIR issues revenue regulations, revenue memorandum circulars, and rulings to clarify the application of tax laws. These interpretations are administrative in nature and aim to guide taxpayers and revenue officers. For example, RMC number 38-2024 clarified that the Supreme Court ruling in Asia's Philippines Cellular Satellite Corporation versus the Commission on Internal Revenue does not automatically apply to all cross-border service agreements. Instead, the source of income must be determined by examining where the income-producing activity occurs. Judicial interpretation. The Supreme Court and the Court of Tax Appeals play a crucial role in interpreting tax laws, especially when disputes arise. In the case of People versus Joel Mendez, the Supreme Court emphasized that a final tax assessment is not required before a criminal prosecution for tax violation. However, for civil liability, a final assessment by the Commissioner of Internal Revenue is necessary. This distinction highlights the dual nature of tax law enforcement, civil and penal, and the importance of due process in tax assessments. In interpretation, some guiding principles include situs of income. Income is considered sourced from the Philippines if the activity or service that generates the income occurs within the country. Benefits received theory. Taxation is justified when the taxpayer benefits from the protection and infrastructure provided by the Philippine government. And substance over form. The actual nature of a transaction prevails over its legal form when determining tax liability. In the Philippines, the interpretation of tax exemptions is governed by the National Internal Revenue Code. Relevant laws such as the Create More Act and implementing regulations issued by the Bureau of Internal Revenue. General principles of interpretation. Strict interpretation against the taxpayer. Tax exemptions are construed strictly against the taxpayer and liberally in the favor of the government. This means that unless the exemption is clearly and unequivocally stated in the law, it cannot be presumed. Burden of proof. The taxpayer claiming an exemption must prove entitlement by complying with all statutory and procedural requirements. Legal basis and key regulations. Section 32 of the NIRC. This section lists specific exclusions from gross income which are considered tax exempt. This includes proceeds of life insurance, gifts, bequests and devices, compensation for injuries or sickness, and income exempt under treaty obligations. Revenue Regulations Number 18-2024. This regulation implements Sections 32V Number 5 of the NIRC as amended by the Create More Act or RA number 12066. It clarifies that income excluded from gross income due to treaty obligations is exempt from income tax, and the list of exempted economies and administrative regions is provided by the Department of Foreign Affairs and updated regularly. Procedural requirements. To avail of exemptions, taxpayer must attach certifications from relevant agencies like DepEd, CHED, or TESDA, submit sworn declarations and supporting documents, and maintain records for BIR post-audit. Interpretation of tax rules and regulations. The interpretation of tax rules and regulations is guided by statutory law, administrative issuance, and judicial decisions. Here is a structured overview of how these interpretations are approached. Legal and administrative framework. The National Internal Revenue Code serves as the primary source of tax law. The Bureau of Internal Revenue interprets and implements these laws through revenue regulations, revenue memorandum circulars, and revenue rulings. The BIR website serves as a central hub for accessing these documents and understanding how tax laws are applied in practice. Judicial interpretation. The Court of Tax Appeals and the Supreme Court play a key role in interpreting tax laws, especially in disputes. Their decisions often clarify ambiguous provisions or resolve conflicts between taxpayers and the BIR. The CTA has exclusive jurisdiction over appeals involving disputed tax assessments, refunds of internal revenue taxes and penalties, and other matters under the NIRC. Application in specific cases. Example, RMC number 38/2024. This circular clarified that ruling in ASAS Philippines does not automatically apply to all cross-border service agreements. Instead, each case must be evaluated based on where the service is performed, whether the activity is essential to the income generation, and whether the Philippine entity receives the benefit of the service. This aligns with the benefits received theory, which justifies taxation based on the protection and infrastructure provided by the Philippine government. The interpretation of penal provisions in Philippine taxation is governed by the National Internal Revenue Code, as amended and clarified through Supreme Court rulings and the Bureau of Internal Revenue Regulation. Nature of penal provisions in taxation. Penal provisions in tax laws are intended to punish willful violations such as tax evasion, fraudulent reporting, and non-compliance with mandated systems. These provisions are interpreted strictly against the government and liberally in favor of the accused, following general principle of criminal law, with emphasis on intent. In cases of mala prohibita, acts criminalized by statute, although intent may not always be required. Key penal provisions under the NIRC. Under Revenue Regulations number 13-2021, which implements the Train Law amendments to the NRIC, the following acts are penalized. Attempt to evade or defeat tax. Penalty, 500,000 to 10 million, fine, and 6 to 10 years imprisonment. Applies to any person who willfully attempts to evade taxes. Fraudulent printing of receipts or invoices. Includes unauthorized printing, multiple sets, or missing taxpayer details. Penalty, same as above. Failure to transmit sales data. For taxpayers required to use the BIR's electronic sales reporting system, penalty is 1/10 of 1% of annual net income or 10,000 per day, whichever is higher. And permanent closure of if violation exceeds 180 days. Use of sales suppression devices includes software or devices that hide or alter sales records. Penalty, 500,000 to 10 million and 2 to 4 years imprisonment. Economic sabotage if suppression exceeds 50 million. Fuel marking violation includes sale of unmarked fuel, use of counterfeit markers, and tampering. Penalties range from 2.5 million to 10 million and 4 to 8 years imprisonment with license revocation for repeat offense. The application of tax laws in the Philippines involves a structured process governed by the National Internal Revenue Code, implemented by the Bureau of Internal Revenue, and interpreted by the Court of Tax Appeals. Administrative application by the BIR. The BIR enforces tax laws through tax assessments and collection, issuance of revenue regulations, revenue memorandum circulars, and revenue memorandum orders. Electronic systems like EBIR forms and electronic filing and payment systems to streamline compliance. For example, RMC number 31/2025 outlines the tax obligation of real estate businesses, specifying the required forms and procedures for withholding and documentary stamp taxes. Monitoring and enforcement. The BIR conducts audits and investigations to ensure compliance. Under RR number 12/2025, enforcement includes serving warrants of distraint and levy, issuing notice of tax lien and encumbrances, and tracking resurfaced taxpayers for enforcement action. Additionally, RMO number 1023/2013 prescribes procedures for issuing subpoenas duces tecum to compel submission of records. Non-compliance may lead to criminal prosecution under Section 266 of the NRIC. Judicial application by the Court of Tax Appeals. The Court of Tax Appeals interprets and applies tax laws in disputes involving tax assessments and refunds, penalties and violations, criminal cases under the NIRC, and local and property tax cases. The CTA has exclusive appellate jurisdiction over decisions of the BIR and other tax authorities. It may sit en banc or in divisions, and its decision can be appealed to by the Supreme Court.